today, can anyone remember what we said that we were going to look at this morning?
No idea.
So it was kind of linked. So
Chloe knows.
so Chloe knows.
Fear. Yeah.
It was fear.
I'm impressed.
So
She told me yesterday.
She switched on today.
yeah. So remember we looked at disgust, shame, and guilt, which was all kind of part of our body's way of trying to protect ourselves. And fear is another one of those emotions that we have to try and protect us. So we're going to look at that today. Does anyone think about what might be different to fear to something like disgust?
You just like to say broccoli on pizza, for example. You don't like it, where somebody might be like absolutely terrified of having like broccoli. Yeah, and just be like, ah, it's I love that.
So anyone else got any ideas what fear might?
Fear can kind of be like a bit more drastic. Like,
More drastic than disgust.
yeah, because disgust is just like, yeah, I really don't like that. And then fear is just like, ah! Yeah.
Okay. What do you think, Seb?
Fear can like protect you from dangerous things, and disgust can protect you from like things that might harm you internally.
Okay. Well, yeah, they both protect you from things. If we remember that disgust was a list of things, do you think that fear is a list of things, or is it something different? Honey, what do you think?
I think it's as well a list of things that you might be scared of and you want to like stay away from. I think it might be a list as well. I'm not sure.
Josh, what do you think?
Because I can't remember from Inside Out where Fear had all this big pack of lists before Riley went to school. Where I don't remember Disgust having any lists before.
No. So yeah, so in Inside Out, he did manage to make a big list, but actually, were they lists or were they something different?
They were scenarios.
They were scenarios, weren't they? Different scenarios. So the thing about fear is it's actually majorly creative. It is an amazing thing in your brain that your brain, it's just kind of creation overload. So where disgust might be kind of like right brain making a list, right, this, we need to avoid. Fear is very much left brain in your creativity, because fear is all to do with creating story. Seems a bit weird, doesn't it? I don't suppose you imagine fear and story. So we're not talking about like a threat response, that's something different. But fear, if you think about it, if you fear something, it's a story in your mind. So for instance, say there was a spider on the floor here. There isn't. Say there was a spider on the floor. Disgust would kind of say, oh, we keep away from spiders. But what fear does is fear, you look at that spider and you imagine that that spider may come running towards you, jump on you and sink its teeth into you and bite you, and then you'll be poisoned and die. Do you see the difference there? Fear is a story. Because when you fear something, it's not that actually, it's just that thing. It's what that thing would do and what it could do to you.
Like I have a lot of scenarios like that. I have like my recording studio and my wardrobe. I open the handle and wait, what if there's a tarantula in there? And I'm like, I ain't recording. Like if I want to plug in my laptop, I go behind my bed and I'm like, what if there's a spider right there and it's gonna bite me? I'm not doing that.
It takes amazing creation and imagination. So it may figure that actually the more creative a person you are, the more likely that you may fear things. Now, I'm going to tell you a very quick story about something that really happened, and it inspired the story of Moby Dick. I don't know if anyone's ever read the book of Moby Dick. It's a very long book. But basically, there was the ship, the HMS Essex, I think it was, and it was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And I don't know if you know the Pacific Ocean, that's kind of like that big bit on the globe where it's like just loads and loads of water. In fact, they were the furthest away from any part of land that was possible on the planet. There was nowhere else where they could be further away from land. And they had trouble with this sperm whale, which was a massive whale, and it had attacked their boat, damaging it. And it meant that they couldn't get to where they needed to go, and they needed to use the emergency boat to kind of get somewhere. Now, they only had very limited rations, and the nearest piece of land was about 1,000 miles away. Now, this nearest island, they had heard that there was cannibals living on this island. So they were all terrified that if they went to this island, that they may be eaten. So they made the decision to go to a further place at the bottom of South America, which was like 1,500, so almost half as far again, miles away. Now, when they were going there in the boat, they ran out of rations and they all died because of starvation, because they had no food left. And by the time they got, so they all died anyway. And actually, some of the stuff that they worried about actually happened inside the boat without freaking you out too much, because they were just desperate. Now, what happened in that place was,
They ate each other.
as they died, yeah. It's gross, isn't it? And that story inspired Moby Dick. Now, that's a true story. That's something that really happened. Now, what all the people that have looked into that incident have said is, if they had just gone to that first island, they would have made it. They would have been able to get there. They had enough rations to get to that first island. But because of the story that they'd made up in their head about being eaten by cannibals, they all died. It was fear that caused them. It was an irrational fear. It was a story that they let play out in their head. And actually, if they'd just gone to that first island, they probably would have all lived. But they were worried. They hadn't thought about dying of starvation. They were just worried about being eaten by cannibals. And this is the thing about fears. They're all stories, and they're all possibilities, and they are all things that could happen. And you need to choose which story you want to believe, okay? So I've got a little 5-minute clip for you to watch about the story of the Bible.
The Bible's an important book, but it's really long.
Yeah, it's a collection of many books written over a long period of time, but altogether they tell one unified story.
So, what's the story of the Bible?
Well, it begins by introducing us to a beautiful mind, the author of all reality, a being called God. And he has the power to take the dark chaos of the uncreated world and bring about order and beauty and a garden full of life.
And to crown this accomplishment, God appoints these creatures called humanity,
Or in Hebrew, Adam.
and they're made as God's image.
Which means that they're commissioned to rule this beautiful world on God's behalf by harnessing all of its potential and creating even more beauty and order.
This is a story about humans using their power to do meaningful, life-giving work. But the question is, how?
Yeah, humanity now faces a choice that's represented by a fruit tree. So humans could partner with God and find freedom by trusting in his knowledge of good and evil.
Or
They could seize power and define good and evil on their own, which, God warns, will kill them.
and they hear the voice of a dark, mysterious creature that tells them the choice is simple. Take the fruit. It'll give you power and freedom to rule the world on your own terms.
And so they seize this knowledge, and as a result, they become suspicious and self-protective. It leads to fractured relationships, violent power grabs, and ultimately, a whole civilization, Babylon, that has redefined evil as good. And so, God scatters this corrupted human project.
And here the story of the Bible takes an important turn. We zoom into the story of a man and a woman who come out of Babylon, Abraham and Sarah.
Yeah, God promises that from them will come a new people, a nation that has another chance to make the right choice. And if they succeed, it will open up this new way forward for the rest of humanity.
And this is why the rest of the Bible story is about this family.
And it does not go well. Despite God's personal guidance, Abraham's family gives in to that same temptation to redefine good and evil on their own terms, apart from God.
Even when their best people were in charge, rulers who loved God's guidance and had divine wisdom, even they gave in.
And so Israel was warned by their own prophets that these choices would lead them back to Babylon, this time as conquered captives living in exile, and that's exactly what happened.
So even with God's personal guidance, Israel fails, who can succeed?
Well, the prophet said that the story wasn't over. God's going to send a new leader to Israel to cover for their failures and to transform the people's hearts and minds so that they can make the right choice.
And so the part of the Bible called the Old Testament ends, and these promises are left hanging.
And then the biblical story continues into the New Testament. We're introduced to a man who comes from the line of Israel's kings, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said that he was bringing all these promises to their completion.
He confronted that dark, mysterious evil that all humanity is given into and resisted its power.
And then he announced that God had arrived to rule the world through himself. Jesus taught about God's definition of good and evil, and he said that real power is serving others. According to Jesus, it's people who love the poor and even love their enemies. These are the kinds of people who actually rule the world.
And that's confusing, but also really beautiful.
And so is the claim that the story goes on to make about Jesus, that he is God become human, to be for Israel and for all humanity what we could never be for ourselves. He came to take the consequences of our evil into himself, and his sacrificial love proved more powerful than evil, than even death itself.
So now humanity's presented with a new choice.
Represented by a new tree.
Stick with the old way of being human, or venture into this new way.
And in the story, those who choose the way of Jesus find themselves energized by God's own power. People who know that they are loved and forgiven by God can become people who love and forgive others in return.
The Jesus movement quickly spread throughout the world, forming these new communities of people who follow the way of Jesus.
But they faced problems. There was persecution from the outside by people in power, and inside there was confusion, even compromise.
Yeah, because following Jesus is really hard.
And so the movement's leaders, called apostles, they wrote letters to comfort and to challenge these communities to stay faithful to the difficult way of Jesus.
And they're called to hope for the day when Jesus will come and change everything.
And so the Bible ends by pointing to the future day, when all wrongs are made right, when evil is eradicated, heaven and earth are united, and humanity can rule the world together in the love and power of God.
Okay, so that's the story of the Bible, and it brings all of these books together.
But what's interesting is that each book contains a different kind of literature that contributes to this story in a unique way, and that's what the next video will begin to explore.
Fear is about a story, isn't it? And what I liked in this illustration is you can see that there's quite often a crossroads. And there's the story over here, and there's the story over here. Now you will have loads of crossroads, and every time you come to some place, there will be a story over here, and there will be a story here. And you have the power to decide which story you want to believe in and you want to follow. Because as we looked at joy, do you remember what we talked about? So joy, when you set your sights on something, you find yourselves going there. Like when you're cycling or when you're driving or whatever. If you're looking at something, you can't help but go to that destination. So if we were to think of fear and joy, certainly hope being a very similar thing. Hope is hoping for something that's better, isn't it? It's a scenario that could happen. This is also a scenario that could happen, and we need to decide which story that we want to follow. In Psalm 53, verse 3, it says, "When I'm afraid, I will put my trust in you." Now, trust is one of those words. When we talk about trusting something, what are we doing? What do we think? Is it like hope? If you trust something's going to happen, you believe it's going to happen. So when we are afraid, when we look at things that cause us to think, oh crumbs, do you know what? I could go to school and that person who really doesn't like me could be there, and actually he could call me names, he could bully me, he could do that to me, and actually I could end up having a really, really bad day today. That's fear. That's the story that you think could happen, that you've created in your mind. Putting your trust in God is saying, but hang about, I know, God, that actually you want the best for me and you're always there. No matter where I go, you're going to protect me. So actually, do you know what? No matter what happens in this scenario, when I come to school, I know that, God, you're going to be there for me, and actually I could have the best day that I've ever had. Do you see what it's doing there? So it's about saying, I'm not going to choose that story, I'm going to choose God's story. So my question to you is, have you been afraid? Yeah? I don't think there's one person on the planet that has never been afraid. You know, I think even Jesus, when he was going to the cross, he knew what was going to happen, and he said, you know, Lord, if there is any other way, let it be, but not my will, but your will. You know, he knew what could happen, but he decided to trust God. I can remember when I used to go mountain biking a lot, when I first started out and I really got into jumps, and we went up Bradley Hollow and we dug all these big dirt jumps out, and I can remember watching all my friends doing these amazing jumps on these dirt jumps that we dug, and I was like, oh, awesome, I'm going to do that. So I went and did it, and I fell off really badly. I mean, the crossbar of the bike went right into somewhere where you didn't want it to go, and there was blood, and it was not nice. But my mate said to me, Jace, you've got to get back on your bike and you've got to do that jump again, and you've got to do it now. He says, because if you don't do it now, you'll never do it again. So I can remember cycling back up to do the same jump, and man, I was terrified, because in my head, I could just see it all happening all over again. And I don't want that to happen again. But I did it, and I jumped, and I landed it, and I was like, whew, and I was able to carry on jumping. It didn't rewrite my story. I was able to overcome my fear. But boy, was I afraid. Is there anything coming up this week that you're fearing? I don't want you to say it out, but I would guess if we all spent just a moment just to think about our week coming up, that we could probably think of something that we're afraid of. So,
if you can't think of anything this week, it could be in the future, okay? It could be something that you know is going to happen, that you know that in a couple of weeks' time this is going to happen, or in a couple of months' time this is going to be happening, or it might be something as close as this week, okay? But I'm sure that there's all something that you know in the future is going to happen that you are fearful of. And that's quite natural, okay? We all have this in us.
So once you've thought of something, and I'm sure you probably will, I just want you to just everyone close your eyes for a moment and just think about that thing that you're afraid of, okay? And what we're going to do is we're just going to ask God to come into our story, because that fear that's in your head is a story that you've created. Heavenly Father, I pray that you would come now by your presence. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you are an amazing creative God. We thank you for our imagination that you've given us. We thank you that all creation and creativity comes from you. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you know what fear is. And we thank you that you have overcome. Lord Jesus, I just pray that you'd come now. You'd come to each one of our stories. You know exactly what that story is that's in our mind, Lord Jesus. And I pray that we would be able to visualize you, Jesus, standing with us in that story. And that you would be able to show us the outcome that you want to come out of that story. Holy Spirit, come.